Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks. Welcome. My name is Mary Bergman, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 7th Annual Nantucket Book Festival on behalf of our entire festival committee. We're so thrilled that you're all here today. I know that some of you have been to multiple events. Has anybody been to all events so far? Look at this. Excellent. We should come up with a prize next year. But as you've probably heard before, and it's true, but the reason why we're here, and we keep moving, hopefully next year, I think we've gotten the message, bigger venues, is because there's so many of you, and we're so thrilled. You know, I think reading and writing can be solitary activities, so it's really important to gather together like this. I want to thank our premier sponsors, the White Elephant and the Nantucket Athenaeum, and I'd also like to thank the Inquirer, Mirror, Mary Ann Stanton, and the Methodist Church who are hosting us in this space. They make it possible for so many of our events to be free, like this one, and open to the public. After this presentation, there'll be a book signing up towards the front, so the books are for sale. And please silence your cell phones. I have heard a cell phone, at least 2, go off in every event, so yeah, thank you. So I'd like to introduce the gentleman to my left, to your right. Joe Hagan has written for Rolling Stone, The Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. He has published long-form profiles and investigative exposés of some of the most significant figures of our time, including Hillary Clinton, Karl Rove, the Bush family, Henry Kissinger, Dan Rather, Goldman Sachs, the New York Times, and Twitter. He lives with his family in New York. Joe is going to be interviewed by Charlie Walters. And many of you know Charlie already, whether you're a listener to his Island Blue Notes radio program or have attended one of his classes on the history of music at the Athenaeum, or like me, spent many hours in music hall, the store Charlie ran until 2006. From 1974 to 1975, Charlie wrote freelance music reviews for Rolling Stone. So I think this is going to be a really special afternoon, and I'm so glad that you're here, so please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
When I went to your website to look into your resume, I saw all the names that Mary just mentioned, and my first thought was, this is quite a switch to go from Henry Kissinger and Hillary Clinton to Jan Wenner. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, maybe it's not such a big shift after all.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, a lot of my career has been spent writing about people in power. And, Jan Wenner, who founder of Rolling Stone, was somebody who was interested in power and pursued power, and Rolling Stone was his entree to the worlds of people like Hillary Clinton and Henry Kissinger, who he surely met in his, social spheres, because a lot of their worlds mixed together. Which tells you something a little bit about what my book is about. How did a guy who started off in San Francisco with a little rock and roll newspaper, end up years on as a guy who is invited to the White House and interviewing the President of the United States? And so through this, in the same way that I would write about these other people, I wrote about him and his kind of circuitous path to a kind of power and a voice in America.
You're right that he wanted to overthrow the establishment by becoming the establishment.
Yeah.
How did you meet Jan Wenner?
I was sitting in a cafe in upstate New York where I live and typing on my computer, as one does in a cafe nowadays, and he walked in. And I knew who he was because I'd been in the magazine business. And so I got up. I was like, well, I don't know what he's doing here. It was unusual to see him in this cafe, and I introduced myself to him. And it turned out he had just bought a big property near where I lived. And he was sort of surprised that a magazine writer, I was writing for New York Magazine at the time, it was up in this area. And so he invited me to his estate. And we sort of just struck up an acquaintance, really, and we would occasionally get together and have lunch or coffee and talk about politics or the magazine business. And one thing led to another, where I wrote a couple of pieces for him, and the 50-year anniversary of Rolling Stone was on the horizon. And he is a guy who's always thinking about things like that, how he's going to plan it, what he would do. And part of his design was to have somebody write his biography. And so he asked me to write his biography over lunch one day. And, the rest unfolded from there. It was kind of a shocking day for me, to be honest.
Let's go back to the start of the magazine, which was 1967.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking before we got out here. That was a year that the Grateful Dead and all those San Francisco bands gained prominence in the United States and around the world. It was a year that Jimi Hendrix and the band Cream had their first albums. It was the year of Monterey Pop. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper was the capstone of all of this. And Rolling Stone came out, I guess, in October of that year for the first time. And the point I made was Winter was the right person in the right place at the right time who wanted to do the right thing, or at least the profitable thing.
Sure.
Had any one of those ingredients not been there, what might have happened or not have happened? Would we be talking about Jan Winter right now?
Well, one of the interesting things to note is there had been another rock magazine before, Crawdaddy, some of you probably have heard of it, by a guy, he was in New York and sometimes in Boston. And that just, and it was one of the first places where you saw sort of intellectuals writing reviews about rock and roll. And it was really the first rock and roll magazine, but it wasn't in San Francisco. And had it been in San Francisco, it might have been a different history. But there was something very special about Jan Winter. And he was the right person at the right time, at the right place. Emphasis on that, because he was not himself a hippie. He wasn't he didn't quite fit in to that countercultural world. He had one foot in, one foot out.
You speak in the book that prior to this, two of his favorite singers were Paul Anka and Johnny Mathis.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Well, I found that was an interesting surprise for me. He wrote that in a letter to his grandmother, and he was saying, he's really into rock and roll, and two of the people he was into are Paul Anka and Johnny Mathis. He like a lot of people in America, a lot of teenagers, when the Beatles were his conversion experience. He saw A Hard Day's Night in a movie theater, and that was it for him. He was like kind of in love with them and saw, the potential for how you could be in the world, having that much fun and being that rebellious and being that smart, as the Beatles. And it was like all the package was there for him. And it was almost like that was the blueprint for him and his whole generation. I was mentioning Crawdaddy. Well, they were sort of avant-garde in a way, Crawdaddy. It was ahead of its time. But Jan wasn't ahead of his time. He was right on his time. He was the average music listener. And in a way, that gave him a gut feeling for what people wanted to read and think about, And in '67 was an interesting time because that was the Monterey International Pop Festival was the first time all these rock groups and rock scenes from around the world were all going to be under one tent. And it was sort of partly designed by record executives. And there was this sort of sense that this is about to happen. This is going to be a business also. And Jan sort of saw that too. He saw the potential for something was about to happen that was going to be bigger than anybody's one band or anybody's one scene. And the book at its core is about ambition. The ambition of this man and the ambition of a generation. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was considered the most ambitious rock album anybody had seen up to that point. It was a full-scale piece of art. And this signaled to the world that these kids are serious. They're really trying to do something, larger than, Dion or whatever that had been before. There was something ambitious at the heart of it. And then Jan represented that.
Well, it got the Beatles on the cover of Time magazine, not because they were teen idols, but because they were artists with a capital A.
Yeah.
And that was a whole new thing, as you say, for this kind of music.
Yeah.
I remember Crawdaddy, and I remember the early issues were mimeograph and staple. I mean, this was was fanzine sort of thing.
Totally.
Yeah. But with Rolling Stone, it wasn't that way. But the way you describe it is, at least in the beginning, was radical conventionality.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, he had taken a newspaper that was published by a professional publishing company, was called the Sunday Ramparts. That looked like a newspaper that your parents would read. And he recycled that as his rock and roll newspaper. And it was almost by happenstance that this happened to be the convenient way that he could deliver his rock and roll magazine vision was, I'll just take this other one that's already laid out and it looks like a professional newspaper. Well, the fact that that it was legible, that it had real journalism in it, and things that we associate with just, whatever other newspaper you had read, but now it's about rock stars, and now it has, stoners in it. This was very novel in 1967. Like, who would have thought that you needed a newspaper to address these kids with their crazy music, right? Well, but Jan was like, no, this is serious, we're doing a real thing, and that was the revelation. But the package itself signaled that they were to be taken seriously because it was conventional. It was an actual newspaper that had columns and was typed and wasn't fact-checked, but it was...
the Oxford Rule. You mentioned the Oxford Rule a lot.
The Oxford Rule, that was a big thing. So one of the things I loved learning was that the Sunday Ramparts, which was it was a pretty funky pop culture magazine in San Francisco at the time, had been designed by an advertising agency in San Francisco. And the designer of it, a woman named Margaret Larson, designed it to be sort of a cheeky parody of British newspapers, really stuffy Times of London sort of British papers, and she used these, what they called the Oxford Rule. You'll see a little box around the text, and it's sort of a preppy design. And so you take this like kind of British, stuffy, preppy design that's pulling from things that have nothing to do with rock and roll, right? But then you're putting rock and roll inside of that. Well, that's an interesting combination. And innovation so often is just two things that already exist, but they're put together in a new way. And that's what Rolling Stone was.
And it probably didn't hurt that advertisers would look at it and say, well, this is not just mimeographs and staples. This is something that's not going to make us look bad.
Right. Well, and at first, though, it was just the advertising was cobbled together from the local advertisers there. It was like the freeform radio station, the head shop, and somebody that wanted to advertise a concert or whatever. But as it got going, the thing that Jan Wenner did, because he was savvy and keeping his eye on the ball, was that this new burgeoning record industry that was starting to evolve around rock and roll was going to need to advertise and talk to the kids. And Jan Wenner turned Rolling Stone into a kind of mouthpiece for this exchange between the record business and the kids. And, I don't think, the Crawdaddy was thinking about that,
I don't think they were either. It was hard to find an ad for anything in Crawdaddy.
Right.
But I started reading it the first year it was out, meaning Rolling Stone. And what I liked about it was the part I ended up writing for, which was the record review section. Because in those days, if you didn't have a source like Rolling Stone, you didn't know what was out there. It wasn't so much what they thought of it. It was, what's been released? Because I'm not seeing it advertised on TV. There is no Entertainment Tonight. Word of mouth only gets you so far. So, I would get it and immediately go to the record review section.
Yep.
Now, talking about being conventional in some ways, on the other hand, in the early days, if you subscribed to it, they gave you a free Roach clip.
They did. That was Jan's idea, yeah.
And there was also a section called The Dope Pages.
Yeah, that's right. Well, listen, the record reviews were always the most popular section in the 70s, especially, for the reason you're saying, is that I heard this new record's coming out, let's see what Greil Marcus or John Landau or these kind of very erudite Berkeley-educated, critics were saying about it. And it gave these critics great power, too, because, they're the ones that are going to be laying the judgment down on this new work of art. To me, what it tells you is that at the time, and this isn't true anymore, really, but rock was so at the center of the youth culture. It was so important to defining what people thought about themselves. Like, I listen to X, and therefore that says a lot about me. I'm into Dylan, and I'm serious about Dylan. So the critics suddenly had this role of really articulating what was important to this very rapt audience who only had Rolling Stone, really. There was very little else out there for a while for them to have this interface with these rock stars. I've had a lot of younger people at some readings and talks, not really understand this because they grew up in the internet age, but to get Rolling Stone in the mail was to get practically the entire internet in the mail. I mean, this is all you had, right? The records themselves, you get a couple of pictures, some lyrics, and if you want to write a letter to, John Lennon, good luck, but here's his address. That put a lot of gravity onto what Jan had there in Rolling Stone. And it gave Jan a lot of power because he suddenly was able to be the gatekeeper for who's going to be on that cover. Who's going to get the big interview? Who do I think is important? Who have we collectively decided is important? And one of the wonderful things I got to do in this book is interview some of the rock stars who had a whole history, whole careers in which they'd been reviewed and written about in Rolling Stone over the years, and find out that, they understood Jan's power and in some cases resented it. They didn't feel like they were taken seriously at certain times, and there's this relationship that was going on between the Beatles and Rolling Stone, and John Lennon was simpatico with Jan at first, and Paul McCartney always kept his distance because he didn't think that they were on his side. And that, all of these sort of secret histories were in every issue of Rolling Stone that you had, but you didn't quite know what was going on there if you were just the lay reader getting it in the mail. And in my book, I was able to kind of find out, how the sausage got made, so to speak.
Well, the music business is a business, and that often gets overlooked, but not in your book. In the beginning, Wenner wrote quite a few reviews, and there's one you pick up on in your book about the Beatles' White Album.
Yeah.
In general, I thought Wenner was one of the most perceptive critics that he had at the paper.
Yeah.
But I don't think he gets enough credit for it. But what you mentioned about the review of the White Album was he came out and said, this isn't so much a group album, it sounds like 4 solo artists whose backup band happens to be the other 3 Beatles.
Yeah.
And the line I remember from the review is, the Beatles may not be the Beatles anymore.
Yeah.
And when I was 18, I had no idea what he was talking about, but 50 years later, I can remember what he said, and he was spot on.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody else picked up on that at the time.
Well, a couple things about that. That review was kind of a recycled review from another guy named David Dalton, who who was in London at the time and was sort of basically embedded in Apple Records, the Beatles record label, and hung out with them. And he got the preview of the White Album and wrote Jan this long letter. And Jan took that letter and kind of just used that as the basis for his review. And he kind of cites him offhandedly in the review, and as David Dalton was telling me or something to this degree, or I borrowed some of this from David Dalton. Of course, David Dalton, when I interviewed him, he goes, yeah, Jan stole my review. But, listen, this was like a loose time when these things could happen, and, they would just be a little petty beef between he and David Dalton, but you read it wherever you were, and you were like, that's brilliant,
Well, I found out years later that there were many times at Abbey Road during the recording of that album when he would go there to the studio, and all 4 Beatles were in the studio in 4 different rooms doing their own things.
Yeah.
So the writing was on the wall for the band. They were, gone 2 years later.
Right, and Rolling Stone covered the dissolution of the Beatles, every little burp that along the road to the end of the Beatles. That was their MO. It was almost like their beat. The Beatles, the Stones, and Dylan were like the core kind of narratives of Rolling Stone, and everything else was kind of coming and going, and it was good, bad, or ugly, but those were the most important. And Jan, really from the outset, and I don't think this was like a novel insight or anything, but he was very disciplined about the fact that these were the things that people wanted to read about, and that's what we're going to stay on top of, is writing about those 3 groups, especially the Beatles. And of course, he loved John Lennon. And as you learn in the book, he formed a kind of hand-in-glove relationship with John Lennon, and Lennon used Rolling Stone to kind of telegraph his own message as the Beatles were breaking up, and to kind of reinvent himself with Yoko. And of course, the most famous example of that was in '68, the 1-year anniversary of Rolling Stone. There's the famous nude photo of both John and Yoko holding hands on the cover of Rolling Stone, which had been banned as an album cover in the US. So he decided to publish it on there. And of course, John Lennon and Yoko loved that and formed a kind of bond with him. And that bond continued for a couple more years at least.
Well, there's no such thing as bad publicity, as they say.
That's right. And they understood the media. You know, the thing about that I enjoyed also learning and reporting about was, you know, maybe it was just sort of like the rose-colored glasses looking back in time. You think that it's just a bunch of kids with idealistic, you know, worldviews, and it's just about the rock and roll and about the freedom and the love, and to some degree that's, you know, embedded in what the listeners experience at least. But John Lennon and Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney were incredibly ambitious people. They wanted to succeed, you know. They wanted to be famous. They enjoyed it, you know, and they knew how to manipulate the media, and they knew that the media was part of it. And they, you know, Jan was going to be their ally, and he presented himself as their ally. I will help you achieve your goals, and we'll do this as a collaboration. We'll be partners in this. And in a way, they're almost as business partners at the beginning because the industry was so small of a thing that, you know, how many outlets were there that were successful like Rolling Stone? None. So he became the thing. And that imbued him with a lot of influence, which he wielded, you know, like a tyrannical king at times. But and that's part of the story.
Well, Jagger was upset, I guess, for a long time, maybe still today, about the name of the magazine.
Yeah.
Of course, that overlooks the fact that the band, the Rolling Stones, took their name from a Muddy Waters song, and I don't think they send him any royalty checks for that.
No, and there's a whole sort of monologue in the book of Mick Jagger saying, well, I know there's the song, but we were a thing. We were like an enterprise. And he took our name and exploited it for his own trademark. And I remember first thinking, wow, they were thinking about trademarks, you know, in 1968 or whatever. I just thought that was really funny. But yes, he was, because it turns out they had a magazine in London called Rolling Stones Magazine. And they were like, what's he doing using our name and for his American newspaper, you know? And this became a sort of subplot of their relationship really for the next 50 years. I mean, later on, they've got lawyers in a room talking about who can use the name for what, as they're each starting little side businesses, you know, and it's fascinating to know that that was part of it. But of course it was going to be, because they're savvy. You know, Mick Jagger is sort of legendarily savvy businessman.
Talk about the falling out that Wenner and Lennon eventually had.
Sure. So the whole opening of the book, as you'll see, is Jan is meeting John Lennon in the flesh for the first time. They had been correspondents up to this time and talked on the phone. And John and Yoko come to San Francisco to see him. They sort of bond over going to see the movie Let It Be. It was the documentary about the album Let It Be and the making of it. And by the end of the visit, John Lennon promises Jan the exclusive interview, you know, after the Beatles break up, which is a huge deal. It's like the Beatles are broken up. John Lennon is going to give a massive interview to Rolling Stone, and it's a coup for Jan. And they do the interview later that year, publish it over 2 issues, and it's a huge thing. And it truly is one of the great celebrity interviews of the 20th century. It's like an amazing interview. And partly because Jan, the way he played it as an interviewer, but a lot of it is just John Lennon unloading in this really visceral way his feelings about the Beatles. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that he had been in what they called primal scream therapy at the time. And so his emotions were quite raw, and he was really letting it all out, and how much he hated the Beatles, and he hated, you know, McCartney's solo record stunk, and I'm mad about everything, and it was pretty intense. Well, then Jan decides, well, this interview was massively successful. Maybe I can put a record out. I have the recording. You know, I could put a record out of this interview, or I could publish it as a book. And he starts to think about how he could exploit it further. And he decides he's going to try to make a book out of it. He could make like $40,000 or $50,000 if he sells this book. This is 1971 money. And but he had made a handshake deal with John that the interview belonged to John Lennon. He was just publishing it. And in fact, John Lennon edited that interview in advance of publication. So this, like I said, these were partners, a business partnership they almost had going here. And so Jan is told in no uncertain terms by John Lennon, do not publish that book. I've already caused a lot of damage with that interview. You know, he hurt Paul McCartney, he hurt George Martin, the producer, he said all these incendiary things, he didn't want that to go any further. And Jan sort of begged and pleaded, no, 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 no. And then finally Jan just said, you know what, it's mine, I'm publishing it. And he published it as a book in the fall of 1971. And Lennon, there's a scene in there that Yoko describes in the interview I did with Yoko Ono. She described Jan calling them at a hotel and telling him, you know, I'm publishing the book and I'll send you 6 free copies. And him being just furious and like, you know, ripping into Jan and then hanging up on him. And Jan tried to beg and plead, oh, come on, let's talk about this. And Lennon was like, no, we're done. And they never spoke again. That was it. That's 1971. So, and one of the reason that, you know, that story, when I've started discovering it, and it was all in Jan's archive, all the correspondence of letters between them and the telegram.
Which you had complete access to.
Yeah. And, you know, here's a telegram from John Lennon, you know, saying some nasty words to Jan, or Jan describing a nasty phone call they had. And so this, you know, if you go through the 70s, I mean, and in some ways Jan was making a calculation. He's thinking, well, the Beatles are broken up, and I got the John Lennon interview. And I think in his mind he thought, well, that was that, you know. But if you flash forward, you know, to 1980, when John Lennon was assassinated, this was a real moment of, like, you know, I think all his history with Lennon and what he had done and how far the magazine had come up to that point really came down on him in a big way. I mean, everybody was experiencing grief over John Lennon when he was assassinated, but for Jan, it was really personal because he had burned him many years before. And right up until that moment, right up at the moment that before he was assassinated, his new record, John Lennon's new record man, David Geffen, had managed to get him to agree to do another Rolling Stone interview 10 years after he had stopped talking to Jan. And Annie Leibovitz, of course, took this famous photograph of John Lennon nude wrapped around Yoko. And that picture was taken 3 hours before he was killed. And so then he was assassinated, and suddenly Jan is sitting there with just, you know, all the emotions that you would have at that moment, but also this sort of negative relationship that he had with him at that moment. And kind of in this kind of wonderful karmic way, he decides that he's going to make the most iconic tribute to John Lennon that, you know, ever. And it really is the most famous issue of Rolling Stone ever published, that one. There was no other words on the cover of that issue of Rolling Stone except Rolling Stone, and there's John Lennon and Yoko right on the cover, and every page in it is about John Lennon. And he was so emotional, Jan, that he refused to have anything written about the assassin. There was no reporting at all about the killer. And in addition to that, he had a message that he wrote to John Lennon. He hand wrote a message, and he had it shrunk down and put into the seam near the staples in every issue of Rolling Stone. And not many people even knew about it. But if you go in there, if you have this issue anywhere at home, or if you see it around, open it up, look inside, you get a magnifying glass, there's a message in there that he made to John Lennon saying, you know, you're with God now, I love you, I miss you, I'll do what I said. Yoko, you know, hang on, you know, love Jan. And he had had a meeting with Yoko in which he basically promised her, you know, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to make sure that the memory of John Lennon survives. And he basically kind of like compensates for what he had done by making sure that John Lennon is you know, beyond just a rock star who died, a icon. And so so that's kind of an amazing tale. It was the biggest selling issue of Rolling Stone to that point, like 2 million copies or something. And then, of course, everything has an equal and opposite reaction, right? Paul McCartney, of course, totally resents the fact that he's turned John Lennon into the only Beatle that matters. And then so Paul McCartney is talking about this in the interview I did with him, all about, you know, he always downplayed me and made it seem like I was just the guy who booked the studio, you know? And this went on to even up to when Jan became sort of the gatekeeper of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He kind of mistreated Paul McCartney because he was always on the other side with Yoko turning John Lennon into this thing. So these kind of crazy, circuitous histories are what this book's about. And it shows you all these relationships that these people had, and they were Shakespearean, you know.
Let me go back in time a little bit. Who was Ralph Gleason, and why is he important to this book?
Sure. He's like a largely forgotten figure, but he's hugely important. He was the co-founder of Rolling Stone. He was Jan Wenner's mentor in being both a journalist and a music appreciator and a music critic. He was a jazz critic. He was in his 40s at the time that Rolling Stone started. And, you know, he was sort of considered this sort of aging beatnik who hung around San Francisco. He had a column in the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle, and he was really a jazz head. He actually had a TV show on in San Francisco called Jazz Casual, and but it was really great. yeah. But it's a great show. You should look it up on YouTube. There's like he'll have Coltrane on and all these people. He's right. I mean, he had this big mustache, the curls, and he wore horn-rimmed glasses, and he's of his time, you know. But he taught Jan everything he knew, and he also taught him about the newspaper business, and kind of was his, you know, sort of you know, rabbi, I guess you would call it, in all the things he did in publishing. And he had a column in the paper in the early days called Perspectives, which after a time people considered kind of like the folky column, you know, because he was always sort of like, you kids don't know what it's like. And eventually he has a huge falling out with Jan and you know, because he thinks Jan has ripped him off, and Jan kind of buys him out for this sort of lowball amount of money, and then he was a diabetic and he died young, and it was sort of a sad chapter in their history. But early on, I mean, it couldn't have happened without him, is the truth, because Jan used his credibility in the rock community, because he was an early champion of the rock world, Ralph Gleason was, and to have somebody 46 years old writing a column in the newspaper saying these rock and roll kids have something going on that's special and promoting them was a big deal. But so Jan kind of dined out on Ralph's credibility and to get advertising, because Ralph would say, I know all these guys that run these record labels because we were all young guys in the 50s together. And so, you know, he helped Jan build the business.
As the magazine moved forward, Wenner started to branch out into non-musical articles.
Yeah.
And Gleason didn't like that. He thought that was a mistake.
Yeah.
But, you know, who's going to tell Jan Wenner what to do?
Yeah, well, yeah.
So this is when people like Hunter Thompson came along.
Right, that's right. Well, listen, I mean, getting to write about this history from year to year to year really took me into how these shifts in the culture were taking place. You know, there's the famous Altamont concert in 1969 that's considered like the end of the 60s, you know. And there was a murder there, and it was terrible, and everything kind of darkens after that in Vietnam.
It was caught on film, too.
It was caught on film. It's like this sort of iconic thing. But after that, this sort of feeling out there is that rock and roll, maybe it's over. Maybe this whole rock and roll revolution is not going to, you know, maybe all the good stuff's behind us now, you know, already, you know. John Landau, the critic in 1970, was writing, you know, I don't think I'm going to be able to get into rock and roll anymore. You know what I mean? It's already over, you know.
This is the same fellow who ended up producing and managing Bruce Springsteen.
That's right.
Should be added.
That's right. Right. Which he saw. I've seen rock and roll's future. He had been in this long state of being kind of like dissatisfied and dyspeptic about the state of rock until Bruce came along, and that's why he jumped ship and became his manager. But so as you turned out of the 60s, there was this sense that, you know, Jan, with his magazine, he had rock and roll sort of nailed down. He had the record labels feeding him ads. He could review records, but he needed to go someplace else with it, and he had met Hunter Thompson. And in a way, I sort of juxtaposed the end of his relationship with John Lennon. The next person that his next muse, as it were, is Hunter Thompson. And he sort of falls in love with him, as Jan does. He's one of these guys that would just like fall in love with somebody, and they would be the thing that would help guide him to the next hill, you know. wherever he wanted to get with his magazine or get in the world. And Hunter sort of was equally ambitious. Here's another guy who wants to basically be the great American novelist. He wants to be the great American writer. He's full of all kinds of chutzpah, and he's a maniac and a drug addict and everything. He's the ultimate kind of countercultural figure. And this is running up right against the moment that George McGovern is going to run for president against Nixon in '72. And the key thing there was, and some of you may remember this, is that the voting age had just been changed from 21 to 18, and that Jan and Hunter saw this as the great opportunity. McGovern did too. McGovern said, I'm gonna capture the youth vote. Now that 18-year-olds can vote, all I gotta do is hook up with Rolling Stone and get some rock and rollers to promote me, and this will be a good strategy, in which they tried that. And Rolling Stone made itself an adjunct of the McGovern campaign. The top donor to McGovern put a lot of money into Rolling Stone. His name was Max Pilevsky. So this was the turning point for Jan, and he decided, when he started seeing how Hunter was writing and how incredible he was, that this new journalism thing that Tom Wolfe was doing, and this new kind of first-person subjective kind of journalism was going to be the next mode of ambition for the youth culture. And rock and roll had been that great thing during the late 60s, but now we're in the 70s, and now journalism is going to be my thing. And he also saw that was going to take him into the world of power, and he really liked that. And through Hunter and that kind of credibility that he was helping build with people, in Washington, Jan eventually establishes a bureau in Washington, D.C., and really makes politics a core of the identity of the newspaper. And again, Jan wasn't just a rock and roll fan. He was somebody full of all this ambition who wanted to take it even further.
With Hunter Thompson, he was one of the great stylists of his time.
Yeah.
But you never knew how much of it was true.
Yeah, right. Well, that was part of the point, was he was just blurring everything with, comedy and, fantasy, and the drugs were sort of an excuse to not know what was real and what wasn't, right? Because I wrote all this on acid, So that was part of the appeal of it too, because the youth culture was very committed to drugs. You cannot take away, you have to really understand that Rolling Stone, the script of Rolling Stone, was a wink at rolling papers. It was this idea that that Victorian lettering was the kind you saw all over the Haight, and it was all about, drug experimentation. And Hunter Thompson was like, we are going to represent the drug takers. And that was what Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was about. They go to Las Vegas to go to a narcotics police convention, and we're going to take tons of drugs and go there. And just, and then of course they all turn into lizards, right? And it's a whole kind of crazy story. But this was perfect for the readers of Rolling Stone, who were becoming kind of, more experienced and more jaded and more wanting to see where this drug culture was going and where the 60s culture was going. And Jan was sort of like, if you could look at Rolling Stone, it's kind of a chronicle of the evolution of the baby boom generation as they come out of the countercultural times into the mainstream.
You can watch the magazine grow up with Jan Wenner and with the readership, which is one of the fascinating things about the magazine.
Yeah.
This is about the time when they started to do a lot of things that you wouldn't have associated with Rolling Stone at the start. Publishing Tom Wolfe.
Yeah.
Publishing the article about the Patty Hearst kidnapping when it was still a huge story.
Yeah.
And finding other writers that, as I say, you wouldn't expect to find in a rock and roll magazine. How was circulation doing at that point? Was there an ever-expanding audience for this sort of thing?
Well, yeah, so let me just pause here a second, because there was a little excerpt in here I wanted to read. Since you brought up Tom Wolfe, it's like a good excerpt, a good sort of segue into this. And since he just died, he's like a hero of mine. I grew up reading him, and if you're in the journalism business, it's hard. You can't avoid. You have to read him and understand what he did. And but he was also a great observer of Jan Wenner and his generation, because he was older than them. And of course, he wrote the electric Kool-Aid acid test from the viewpoint of somebody who wasn't really in it. He was sort of standing bemused, looking at it and saying, what are these kids doing, you know? And so he always had a great kind of dry, kind of humorous, I thought, but very sharp observation about this generation. And he said, he told Rolling Stone in the late 80s in an interview that the youth culture in the 60s was the most important thing to emerge from the 60s, more than Vietnam or civil rights, he said. It's a controversial thing to say, but here's what he said. Any of the big historical events of the 60s are overshadowed by what young people did. And they did it because they had money. For the first time in the history of man, young people had money, the personal freedom in the free time to build monuments and pleasure palaces to their own tastes. And I go on to say here that Jan, by birthright and inclination, was the ideal tastemaker to build those monuments. And, you know, when Jan, you know, Rolling Stone in many ways, I think Jan Wenner recognized that rock and roll, it was so powerful of an expression. I mean, anybody who came from that time, who is a fan of rock and roll, if you've ever been, you know, in a rapture over a rock and roll song, you know how powerful it is. Well, back then, they were inventing it right in real time in that moment. Jan recognized that this was the first expression of power by this generation, and that they were going to take over everything. You know, that this power was going to express itself all across the culture, and that they were going to go to the center of the culture, right into Washington, D.C., and take those levers, and, you know, the revolution was here. And Rolling Stone was going to be a part of that. And so in terms of Jan's ambition, to get Tom Wolfe into his newspaper was, for him, it was like getting a trophy, you know, because Tom Wolfe was famous at that time. And he got the famous Tom Wolfe to be published in his newspaper. And so after that, people started to really take Rolling Stone more seriously. And you had, like, you know, Norman Mailer and real famous writers were starting to pay attention to Rolling Stone, and Jan was developing this reputation. And of course, he would get business guys who understood, how can we take this even further and go to Madison Avenue and start collecting on this. And as that started to happen in the mid-'70s, especially with Patty Hearst, you know, I don't know how many guys remember this, but Rolling Stone basically was the first to tell the story of what happened with Patty Hearst behind the scenes, how she got kidnapped, the Stockholm Syndrome thing, and they were on the lam, and all these crazy adventure. Rolling Stone had that story, and it made international news. It put them on a stage that was way bigger than they had ever been before. And basically, the Rolling Stone, as we all think of it, when you hear that name, Rolling Stone, and all the kind of associations that it has, really, that was where it really punctured into the mainstream as never before. And that was 75, 76.
I remember just a couple of years after that, I picked up the paper, and there on the cover is Johnny Carson. Yeah. And there was a long Johnny Carson interview.
Yeah,
and
Timothy White profile.
Right. And Carson was a very private guy, didn't do interviews, and I still can't get over the fact that when he finally decided to sit down for a long interview, he picked Rolling Stone.
Yeah. And he made jokes about it on TV. And they were all drug jokes. And
the Colombian Contact.
Colombian Contact, because, yeah, this is really in the weeds, but Doc Severinsen, you may recall, was the band leader. And he said, Doc has a cold, but, you know, I'm not going to use I wouldn't use the, you know, cold medicine he uses. Colombian Contact. You know, won't cure your cold, but you won't care. Real Johnny Carson-y joke, you know, but yeah, that was the main, you know, they had entered the mainstream, yeah. And another thing I want to just go back to really quick that I think is important to note that Jan tapped into, that is somewhat controversial, I think, now, which was before Rolling Stone, there had been a lot of teen magazines about pop bands. You know, there were Tiger Beat and 16, and they covered the Beatles, and they covered the Stones, but they were aimed towards girls. And the idea was these young, handsome guys with funny hairdos are like going to be my boyfriend, kind of. That was the sort of framework for those magazines, and what toothpaste does he use, and what's he doing next weekend, that kind of thing. Jan in Rolling Stone, he invented a music magazine that was aimed towards men. It really was aimed primarily towards young male readers, and there were plenty of female readers, but that was not their main readership. And in the early kind of reader polls or reader surveys they would do, they found that it was like, young men between 18 and 25 were reading their magazine. And as a result, and that was a reflection of the rock and roll culture they were covering, which was very male-centric. The artists were largely male, the fans were male, the critics were male, and the women were really a minority in every respect. And it was largely a white, culture too. And they loved black artists, but the black artists were not given the same kind of, coverage, frankly. And so, that was interesting to me in some ways, because you think of the counterculture as so progressive, and that it's for everybody, and there's a certain sense of freedom and liberty that everyone can enjoy, but it was really kind of localized to young white men. And of course, the subplot there is that Jan was closeted, and that he had an admiration and kind of added level of interest in the rock stars themselves, both as a fan and just as sort of like erotic subjects.
And that was one of the best kept secrets outside of the Rolling Stone offices until fairly recently.
Yeah.
The racial thing, Nick Tosches, who was once upon a time a rock critic, he wrote a whole book that revolved around the fact that, in his view, the Rolling Stones and those other bands in the 60s were really an updated minstrel show.
Yeah.
And as you say, Rolling Stone was basically a white magazine with a white audience, but without people like Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry, there wouldn't have been Rolling Stones or Beatles or anybody else. But Rolling Stone didn't pick up on that for a very long time.
Well, and there was a reason for that. Well, so Ralph Gleason, who we mentioned earlier, was a jazz critic. This was his big critique of Rolling Stone, that he made public and privately told Jan, not enough black artists in your magazine. You're not focusing on all this incredible, great music, that's out there. But what they found, especially in the late 70s, as Jan became interested in marketing and figuring out how can I, maximize sales, they were finding that black artists on the cover weren't selling to their white audience, and Jan he didn't put black artists on the cover. And that went on for some time, really, and it was rare that you saw black artists on the cover. And that had a lot to, it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing. It was like, is this the audience's fault? Is it Jan's fault? Or is it just the culture of rock and roll? That's what it was, I don't get that deep into it in the book, but, the reason, there was a great, amazing event you can see on YouTube. It was in the early 80s. I think it was in Detroit. They had a bunch of disc jockeys decided to have a big event where they burned disco records in a giant pile in the middle of a football stadium. And it was all just all these angry white dudes burning disco albums, because the albums were black and gay artists, and they didn't like it, And it really kind of ends up, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, right? I mean, we have things like this happening again and again in history, where you have these reactionary reactions to what people see as too much freedom, or there's too much of these people, or too much of that. And that ended up happening again. And that put actually Rolling Stone in a bind in the early 80s too, I would say, because they ran out of rock stars who could sell the cover, and that's when Jan turns his eye to Hollywood. In the late 70s and the early 80s, the magazine became more propelled by actors and celebrities of that nature. And celebrity in general began to, become central.
I just got a signal to go to questions.
Yeah.
So here's your opportunity.
Yeah. Happy to talk about anything. Yes, sir.
Deal with Michael Jackson.
Well, that was an interesting one because when Michael Jackson came along, he was really the breakthrough black artist for MTV. And he was the record labels were encouraging Jan to put him on the cover because they were saying, it was Walter Yetnikoff at CBS and telling Jan, you've got to put this guy on the cover. This is going to be a huge record. It was Thriller. And Jan was like, no, we don't put R&B people on the cover. And so when the record came out, it was such a huge success. It took like 3 or 4 months, but Rolling Stone eventually felt like they had to. And they put him on the cover. And it was like against their kind of natural instinct to put him on the cover, but he was the breakthrough guy of the moment. And that actually probably was planted the, it sort of was a tipping point for MTV because eventually they started having more black artists on MTV too. And they were also very white, very kind of like narrow at the beginning. But this was the culture. This is not just reflective of any one person, or it was what was going on in the culture, and these just reflected that.
And it still goes on to a certain degree because Saturday Night Live had this similar problem a few years ago. Yeah. People were saying, where are all the black hosts? Where are the black players on the show?
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about your personal relationship with Jan?
Sure, yeah. I'm surprised it took this long to come up. So we've had a falling out. It was sort of an interesting series of events that led to it. But basically, I made it a point that with him at the outset that this had to be an independent book. That there was no way this could be a collaborative thing. I had to do it as a journalistic enterprise. And that meant that he couldn't read the manuscript before publication, because he's a very powerful, very controlling guy, and there was just no way, if he got his hands on that manuscript, you would not be reading the book that you end up reading here. It would have been slashed to pieces, and he would have, had his lawyers jump down my throat or whatever. So that was a deal right from the outset, and he agreed to it. But then a few months before the book came out, the title came out. The publisher said, we're going to publish a biography of Jan Winter. It's called Sticky Fingers. Oh, he didn't like that. He got very upset. And I got it, but I wrote him a letter and I said, here's why it's called this. And it's, this is a book about ambition. It's a book about, to some greed, sex, all these kinds of elements. And it's also a wink to the Rolling Stones. That's the name of the Rolling Stones album. And there's this whole subplot of Rolling Stone and Rolling Stones. And that sort of set him on edge, but I sort of got him to relax about it and told him it was going to be okay. Well, then flash forward a few months, this was last year after Labor Day, I sent him a copy finally. When I learned that the book was at the printing press being printed, I sent him a galley of it. And I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks. And I haven't heard from him since, is the real truth. And he canceled a couple events that we were supposed to be at together. And so for me, my heart sank at first. I kind of knew something like this was going to happen. I didn't know what degree the drama would be. He'd be really pissed about 1 or 2 things, or is he going to be pissed about the whole thing? Because, if you write about somebody objectively, or if you write about somebody in a way that that's not how they think of it themselves, or if they're deeply egotistical and delusional, they might not see what they don't want to believe that this is what happens, or they don't want to believe that this is what people think of them, because there's people quoted in the book that he knows, that he's friends with, who are saying things that are critical. So in any event, I go to my publicist at my publisher's office, and I'm, I feel so terrible. He's so mad. What are we going to do? And he's like, it's going to be okay, Joe. New York Times got a story for you. That's how publishing works. And so it instantly became a controversy, and then you have to kind of ride the controversy of it because that's just what it is. It's not fun to be in that. I would rather it not be that way. And I think maybe one day he'll come around to it. At least I hope so. But I thought writing a 500-page book about the guy, trying to show him in the sweep of the history of the latter half of the 20th century would be something that he might like. But, it's a warts and all sort of vision of what happened. And he was not always a likable guy. And it's hard to write about somebody like that. I don't know if you guys remember when the Steve Jobs book came out. And if you read that book, it's a pretty fascinating book, but he's not a lovable guy. Not soft and cuddly at all. A lot of people disliked him. And the family, after Steve Jobs died, rejected that book and were really angry with Walter Isaacson for writing it. And this turns out to be a thing in biography writing, I've learned. Writing about people, especially living people, is a super complicated thing.
At the very end of the book, you quote one of Wenner's former editors saying he couldn't decide whether he was 51% good or 51% bad, and finally decides he's probably 51% good.
Yeah.
Having read your book, I can tell you firsthand that if you're interested in music from the last 50 years, or journalism, or publishing, or just American culture, this is a must-read. You've done a wonderful job.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.